I'll start with a quick disclosure. Capcom sent me a free copy of the Devil May Cry HD collection for this review. This Devil May Cry HD collection contains high definition versions of Devil May Cry 1, 2 and 3, with the third game being the special edition version. Initially the series was a PlayStation 2 exclusive, with the first game released back in 2001, the sequel 2 years later in 2003 and the third in 2005. The special edition version of the third game came out a year later. This HD collection is effectively a port of the HD collection that came out in 2012 for PS3, Xbox 360 and Windows, although the games now run at 1080p instead of 720p on consoles. When I review remasters or remakes, I try to focus on the whole package as it feels to play today. I can't possibly review the games as they were back in the day because I have a terrible memory, and even if I could remember those feelings, they wouldn't necessarily be the same 17 years later. I also don't have access to either the PS2 originals or the previous HD collection to make fancy comparisons. I'm not reviewing the quality of the remaster as such, although I will be looking at what has been added to the collection that enhances the value of the package. The short but sweet summary of my review is that Devil May Cry is a good game, although you do have to fight against quite a few dated elements of game design from that generation, such as a poor camera and shoddy save system. Devil May Cry 3 is a really good game that I recommend you play if you haven't. The combat is phenomenal and there's a lot of replay value. The special edition includes a couple of quality of life changes that improve the save system, and there's actually a story and a version of Dante that you'll care about. It's still a legitimately good game, no nostalgia required. Devil May Cry 2 is also a video game that is included in this collection. I went back and forth a lot on the final score. The third game is so good that it almost earned this collection a 4-star rating by itself. However, the terrible second game and the overall lack of effort put into this collection drags it down to a 3-star rating. Typically that would mean you'd have to listen to me complaining about the games for the entire video. However, there's a lot to love about this series, and I don't think $30 is a bad price to pay for what you get here. If you haven't played Devil May Cry 3 in particular, then you can probably consider this a tentative recommendation. For those who have played the games before, there's nothing new here to tempt you in. A shorter review of this collection is available on my website. There's a link in the description if you'd rather read that instead. This video will contain spoilers of boss fights, including late game ones, so if you're really sensitive to that kind of stuff in 15-year-old games, then you might want to stop watching. I'm going to look at each game in turn and then talk about the collection as a whole. I rented a copy of Devil May Cry when it first came out back in 2001. I played it for a few hours and didn't enjoy it much. It left so little impression on me that I actually forgot I'd played it. I'd been expecting Devil May Cry to be like the Resident Evil games that I'd loved on PlayStation 1, with a bit of spit and polish for the next generation. I know that sounds ridiculous. Of course Devil May Cry is not like Resident Evil, they aren't even in the same genre. How can anyone get confused between the two? All I can say is that 2001 was a different time. There were no video reviews of games online, and if there were, my internet connection would have been too bad to watch them. Also, Freddos still cost 10p and you had to walk uphill both ways to get to the local game store. I'd been following previews of Devil May Cry in gaming magazines, and they all compared it to the Resident Evil series. Screenshots showed a game with a fixed camera and a gun-toting protagonist who explored the interior of a large castle, collecting keys to open up access to new areas. What I didn't realise at the time was that Devil May Cry was originally planned as a Resident Evil game. During development, Capcom realised the game was becoming a little too action-focused to be part of the Resident Evil series, and so spun it off into a new IP. That was a good call because, as we know, it's important that Resident Evil games not become too action-heavy. I guess the message stuck all the way until reviewers finally got to play the game, but by then it was too late for me. I had an image in my head of what the game should have been, and this wasn't it. Fortunately, I do now appreciate Devil May Cry for what it is. I wasn't completely wrong about the game back in 2001. As I thought back then, the story is more bare bones than an exhibit at the British National History Museum. Dante works as a supernatural detective and happens to be the son of the infamous demon Sparda. It's an interesting enough premise. You can imagine Dante following a lead and getting himself into trouble, much like Leon stumbled upon the chaos at Raccoon Police Station. That's not how it goes down. Trish shows up in Dante's office, and after randomly attacking him, she explains that the demon emperor Mundus is back and needs to be defeated. Suddenly Dante is in a castle on Malay Island. There aren't all that many cutscenes, so you often move from place to place with little in the way of any explanation. The cutscenes that are here have some painfully cheesy dialogue and over-the-top acting.
Trish, devils never cry. These tears are a gift only humans have.
This can work, as it does in Devil May Cry 3, however here it's plain terrible. You could reorder the cutscenes or just shove in completely new ones, and I doubt anyone would notice. But let's be honest, you're not playing Devil May Cry for the story. You're here to explore a mansion and collect red orbs. For some reason Devil May Cry starts off incredibly slowly with a bit of basic exploration as we explore the castle to collect red orbs. Slow starts can work when you're trying to build tension, like that other franchise I've already mentioned way too much, however it's not necessary here and feels tedious. Combat has a lot in common over the 3 games in this collection, however each manages to feel vastly different as well. In Devil May Cry 1 you mainly use a sword called Alistar and gauntlets called Ifrit once you have them. There's one button to swing your sword or fists and one to shoot your guns. You can lock on, and when doing so you can dodge. Dante also has a Devil Trigger ability that gives him unique powers based on the weapon he has equipped. It's incredibly powerful, and correct use of the Devil Trigger can be the difference between life and death. The game rates your combos based on the variety of moves you use and how stylish you look doing it. You can button mash and get through the game, but you'll end up with plenty of D grades at the end. With just one attack button for the sword, the combos are fairly limited. You can do 3 consecutive attacks, or 2 attacks, then either a short or long pause, and then another attack. After collecting enough red orbs, you can buy new attacks such as a thrust and an upper slice that sends enemies into the air where you can juggle them with your guns if you're quick enough. Due to the lack of variety, I never found the combat quite as exciting as it should have been. The difference between a stylish grade and a dull grade is huge in theory, but it doesn't always look that different on screen. This changes drastically by Devil May Cry 3, so I'm probably just looking back on this older one with the higher standards of the third game in mind. Devil May Cry isn't particularly challenging on normal mode. The groups of lesser minions might chip away at your health occasionally, but they'll rarely kill you. No boss took more than 3 attempts on my first run through, and that was without being overly reliant on health items, which are relatively scarce unless you buy them. The only way frustration creeps in is through the continue system, which centres around yellow orbs. All 3 games have yellow orbs, but their implementation is slightly different in each. In Devil May Cry 1, the yellow orbs are effectively lives. If you die and have a yellow orb left, you can continue from the previous checkpoint, which is probably close by or just before the boss. However, there aren't many yellow orbs to collect, and they are expensive to buy. Once you've run out, you'll have to start the missions all over again. Most missions are short, and once you know what you're doing, you can run past enemies that aren't mandatory. However, it's still annoying. I preferred spending my red orbs on weapon upgrades instead of yellow orbs, so when I did die I had to start again. If you do find the going too tough, you can turn the difficulty down after about an hour, or you can just farm red orbs to buy loads of health items. However, there are no harder options available until you've completed the game at least once. That won't take long. My first run through was probably about 9 hours, and you can do it in a lot less if you skip the cutscenes and are, good. Devil May Cry is a classic, but I can't pretend I loved my most recent playthrough. It's hard to avoid using the term dated when discussing older games, so I'll just say that the camera is old-fashioned and infuriating. It switches around constantly as you move about the castle, so you have to keep adjusting the direction you're pushing on the analog stick just to continue in the same direction. This moves from a nuisance to a nightmare when you're in combat. A couple of moves are direction sensitive, so if the camera makes a quick switch then you'll end up pressing towards the enemy instead of away, and vice versa. This isn't something I'd expect to be improved in a remaster because it's a fundamental part of the game, but that doesn't mean it's not annoying. While the game isn't that long, there's still a noticeable lack of enemy variety both in mob battles and bosses. With the mobs you'll mainly fight marionettes and sin scissors, and you don't have to change up tactics much. For bosses you fight the Spider Phantom a couple of times, and you'll fight the Griffin, Nightmare and Nello Angelo 3 times each. These boss battles change slightly each time, but only slightly. The final boss is pretty cool, mind you. You can find secret missions dotted around the castle. They're typically uncovered by backtracking and going through doors you've already been through. It's a weird way to hide secret content. I wasn't about to go backtracking throughout the entire game just to find them, but I stumbled upon a couple, like killing loads of small spiders in a time limit, or jumping on skulls to reach a blue orb that provides extra health. Devil May Cry is still a decent game. You'll spend as much time fighting against the camera as you do the Griffin, but there's much more to combat than the one button attack mode initially suggests. Completing the harder difficulty settings unlocks extra characters to play as, so you're certainly rewarded for your efforts. I'd rather spend my time replaying the third game, but we'll get to that. Given its slightly turbulent development, it's not a huge surprise that Devil May Cry feels a little lacking, but that's what sequels are for. Devil May Cry put in the groundwork and set the stage for something bigger and better to come along. In 2003, Devil May Cry 2 rocked up onto that stage with a confident swagger. It stood there, looked around at the eager crowd, and then took a huge dump over everything left there by its predecessor. It then charged the crowd for the privilege of watching. Devil May Cry 2 looks a lot like the first game. It's not. Once you play it, you feel the difference immediately. It's a mess, and so bad that I'm slightly surprised we ever got a third game. The setup is somehow even more threadbare than the previous entry. Lucia introduces Dante to a woman who once fought alongside his father Spada. She asks him to kill a demon who is hiding as the CEO of a large corporation, and in exchange she will give him more information about his father. Once again, there aren't many cutscenes, and the ones we do have appear utterly unconnected to anything else that is going on. Basically, some CEO of a megacorporation is trying to use his power to take over the world, which feels strangely believable these days, but that's about all the motivation we have. The first Devil May Cry didn't need to worry about its poor story because the gameplay was so good. Devil May Cry 2 doesn't have that luxury. Annoyingly, the game makes a strong first impression, well, once you get past another slow start that is frustratingly devoid of combat. Dante has most of his moves from the first game from the start of this one. He can already double jump, he can do the stinger thrust, high time, and even run along walls. If this is what we have at the start, just imagine what the next few hours would unlock. Go ahead, imagine it. Whatever you just thought of was better than what is actually in the game. Instead of getting new weapon types and acquiring new abilities, you get swords with all the same abilities you already have. One of the swords is slightly longer than the one you start with, and the other is slightly shorter. You can level up these swords for a damage buff, although it doesn't tell you what actual effect it has. The lack of new weapons and abilities is disappointing, but it's not what makes the game bad. That's reserved for the moment-to-moment combat. There are a couple of problems. First, the levels and combat arenas are now much bigger, and enemies are more spaced out as a result. The previous game had you fighting in cramped corridors and small rooms. It was easier to chain combos together because there'd always be another enemy to switch to when you needed it. In the sequel, there's no point waiting for enemies to come to you. They are completely apathetic to your presence, refusing to fight you as if it's 1 minute past 5 on a Friday and they have a strong union. Combat isn't helped by how overpowered your guns are this time around. They used to just be for maintaining combos, however they can now decimate your enemies without the need to get your sword bloody. It's one thing to beat the general mobs with your guns, but you can do the same thing with sub-bosses and even the main bosses. It's really boring, and I made the conscious decision to stop using them even though it was the easiest way to defeat enemies. You can switch the lock on this time around, although it rarely works properly, and good luck hitting an enemy if you aren't properly locked on. Your hits often refuse to hit targets right in front of you, especially non-enemy items that need to be hit. I also managed to miss out on an important upgrade because I managed to get through this door within the time limit, even though it should only have been possible with the speed up ability that was elsewhere in the level. I never could go back to get it. Overall, the sequel is embarrassingly easy on the normal difficulty, which again is all you have available at the start. This playthrough only took about 4 hours, although it felt like more. The end boss is a complete mess and probably the hardest part of the game, although that's not saying a lot. In fact, only the first phase of the boss fight is remotely difficult, and then it's only bad if you get caught by a couple of untimely blasts from the front end of this monstrosity. There's no learning attack patterns and using skill and muscle memory to beat the final challenge. You just find safe spots from the attacks and hack away until each separate part is defeated. Yellow orbs make their return. This time they automatically revive you upon death regardless of whether you want to use them or not. This could mean you end up completely wasting a precious resource on a random death that isn't important. However, given how easily the game is overall, this isn't likely to be a huge problem. The implementation is still terrible though. As was tradition with sequels back in the day, you can play as a second character. Lucia's story is slightly shorter and just involves going back through pretty much the same levels. It's not new content, just an attempt to make up for the game's short runtime. She uses dual daggers instead of a sword, and the animations are different, however it all quickly feels remarkably similar. You can also play as Trish from the first game after you complete the game on hard. I haven't done that and have no intention of doing so. Devil May Cry 2 has exactly the same camera problems as the first game, so I won't go through all that again. Special missions make a return, but they are ridiculously easy this time. Most of them just consist of killing 2 phases of enemies without a time limit. The sound and music in the first and third games are nothing to write home about, which is why I don't bother talking about it much. It gets up tempo when you're in fights and stops when you aren't, but it doesn't particularly do it for me. However, the sound design in the second game is terrible. Take this stage as an example. A power plant is about to explode, but I've never heard such a casual nuclear meltdown warning.
Caution. Warning.
My wife makes more noise when I leave the downstairs light on. I should probably say something nice. Dante and Lucia have a cool cel-shaded art style which looks really good. It doesn't fit in with the environment at all though. I know it can be hard to ignore a game when playing through a series, especially if you've bought a collection like this one and have effectively already paid for it. Devil May Cry 2 barely takes any time to complete, and yet it still isn't worth your time. Skip it and spend your time on the far better third game instead. If Devil May Cry 2 is every bit as bad as you've heard, then Devil May Cry 3 is every bit as good. We now have a story with meaningful cutscenes, actual characters with personalities, multiple fighting styles, a moderate challenge, plenty of replay value, and they fixed the mess that is the Yellow Orb situation. The version of Devil May Cry 3 included in this collection is the Special Edition. This lowers the difficulty of the original release, which made the Western version substantially harder than the Japanese version for some reason. Presumably to distance itself from the disaster that was the second game, Devil May Cry 3 is a prequel starring a much younger version of Dante who hasn't opened his demon hunting business yet. Dante is cocky and annoying as hell with an over-the-top attitude and love of pizza that reminds me of Michelangelo from 90s Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles cartoons. He constantly performs flashy and impossible moves that are borderline comical. This time it feels you're laughing with the game though, not at it. Best of all, the game doesn't start with a slow exploration mission. You're thrown straight into the action as demons attack Dante's office and ruin the place before he can even open. There's an antagonist that we care about this time, Dante's brother Virgil, and a sub-story revolving around Mary and her father Arkham, who is working for Virgil. All missions start and end with cutscenes that do basic things like explain who the hell the random bosses are and why Dante is fighting them. If this all sounds like basic storytelling, then yes, it is. However, after the previous 2 games, this is borderline miraculous. It's hard to exaggerate the leap in quality from 2 to 3 and the extra effort that clearly went into this one. To be clear, the story is still absolute nonsense, but it revels in the nonsense, and milks it to show us glorious cutscenes of Dante at his best. If you've ever heard people talk fondly of Dante as a character, then there's a good chance they are thinking of Dante from Devil May Cry 3. Combat is unrecognisable from the previous entry. Dante now starts off able to choose between 4 different combat styles and later picks up 2 more. Trickster style is great for maintaining combos because it gives you dodges with invincibility frames. It's also pretty good for advanced techniques like jump cancelling because you can dodge around in the air, which helps you land on enemies and get extra jumps without touching the floor. Swordmaster is probably the flashiest to look at. Instead of dodging, you get a completely different secondary attack for each weapon and more moves as you level up the style. You're more vulnerable, but so long as you pick the right attacks, you can stagger enemies and avoid taking damage. Gunslinger is similar to Swordmaster except with a focus on guns. This is the only one I'm not particularly keen to use because I've always preferred using my sword for combat and keeping guns to a minimum. Royal Guard is the style you might want to try in your second playthrough. It's a little trickier to grasp because you have to understand all the enemy attacks to correctly time blocks. When you succeed, you can pull off some devastating attacks. Later on in the game, you'll gain the Quicksilver style to slow down time, and Doppelganger to create a second version of Dante to fight alongside you. You might want to focus on one style for a while because the more time you spend with each style, the quicker you'll level it up, which in turn adds more moves. There are plenty of weapons this time around, and I'm not just talking about an extra inch on the end of your sword, which I've been promised multiple times is actually not that important and I shouldn't worry about it. You do have a normal sword, but you also have dual swords, the 3-rod Cerberus, a guitar that controls bats, and more. We're back to the original method of buying upgrades for each weapon, which is my preferred way of doing it. It's a bit annoying to have to unlock the double jump multiple times though. If you quickly change from one weapon that has the double jump to another that doesn't, then you can be quickly knocked out of your stride. Moves like that should probably be linked to Dante and not each weapon. We're also back to smaller combat arenas with enemies who have been promised a raise if they meet their damage targets. This makes combat far more frantic than the previous game, although conversely combos are now easier to pull off. Enemies have varied attacks and you'll have to come up with tactics to decide how to take them down and in what order. One enemy will split into 2 if you attack it with your sword, so you have to shoot it enough for it to turn to stone and then destroy it. Spiders can catch you in their webs. There are enemies that continually summon in more enemies, so you want to take them down first. Boss fights also require some thought. It's quite possible to get battered the first time you fight them, but once you've figured out their moves you can easily get through the fights without using any health items or even taking much damage. This makes them satisfying. They aren't easy, but the challenge isn't in how cheap they are either. They're fair fights that you need to learn. Even in the first game I didn't find good combos all that rewarding. If the style meter wasn't on the screen it would be hard to tell the difference between a good combo and a bad one. You could just button mash your way through. In 3 you won't even care about the rating. What's important is that getting good combos is the way to get through the fights themselves and you'll look great doing it. The power of the Devil Trigger has been nerfed slightly. It's still useful, but you don't have access to it at all for a couple of hours, and when you do it doesn't tend to mean the difference between victory and defeat. The game even takes the remarkable step of telling you what combos each weapon can perform and gives you statues to practice them on. If you get the combo score high enough on one of these statues, then you're rewarded with a blue orb that gives a health boost. The secret missions are also far less obtuse in how you access them, and they provide a decent and entertaining challenge to help you improve your skills, such as staying in the air for 20 seconds. Best of all, the situation with yellow orbs has been fixed. When you start the special edition of Devil May Cry 3, you can choose between playing the yellow or gold version of the game. It doesn't tell you what this choice means, by the way. Choosing the yellow option gives you the standard version of the game where you'll need to use yellow orbs to continue. When you die, you're given the choice of whether or not to use the orb. If you don't want to use it, you'll start the mission again. This is better than Devil May Cry 2, which made you use the orb without giving you a choice. However, given that you can only hold one at a time and some of the missions are huge with multiple bosses, this is not ideal. That's where the gold version comes in. If you play the gold version of Devil May Cry 3, you can restart from the nearest checkpoint whenever you die. These are usually quite generous and don't require you to repeat much content, especially just before bosses. Importantly, I'd argue that this doesn't make the game easier and actually encourages you to get better at the game. Making you replay entire missions because you died right at the end of a boss fight is an excessive punishment and wastes the player's time. Knowing I'd have to restart an entire mission upon death would just make me stock up on health items, and use as many of them as it takes to get through the fight. I'd farm red orbs if I needed to get more. Without needing to repeat loads of content, I can focus on mastering the boss fights. I don't mind dying because I can just try again. I know I can get through the fight without using health items if I learn the patterns and signals, so I make sure I do. I love this, it's a huge improvement on the previous games. There's an increased emphasis on puzzles this time around, which I didn't particularly appreciate. Using the term puzzles is pushing it a bit really. There's a lot of locked doors that are typically opened by a nearby orb of some kind. You can progress through linear levels and pick up an orb and then find your way back to the door you couldn't unlock, which requires that orb to open. It doesn't feel at all satisfying, and most of the time I put no thought into it whatsoever. I would just push through a level, pick up a thing, hit a dead end, and then track back until I found a place to put the thing. Devil May Cry 3 is already a decent length compared to its predecessors, with my normal mode playthrough coming in at nearly 15 hours, so this kind of padding felt unnecessary. There's a puzzle where you have to rotate a couple of mirrors, I guess, and that's about it. The camera is slightly improved, but not by much. Depending on the environment you're in, you might be able to move the camera, however it doesn't have any way to move through walls, and I found it nearly entirely useless. I don't have many other complaints. Devil May Cry 3 is still a really damn good game despite it being over 12 years old now. All 3 games in this collection have replay potential, however this is the only one that I'm going to play again on the harder settings. I want to get better at the combat and I want to try out the different styles. There's a decent argument to be made that it's worth spending the $30 on the collection just for this game. I'll have to let you make your own judgment on that because everyone's financial situation varies. However, I will say that I recommend Devil May Cry 3 to nearly everyone. It's a great game. It's such a shame Capcom didn't go the extra steps to make this collection a must-buy. Overall, there's an almost staggering lack of effort put into this collection, but let's start with the good stuff. The trilogy is now in widescreen at 1080p, running at a silky smooth 60 FPS. That last point isn't a huge deal for those of you in North America who always played the games in 60 FPS. However, I first played these when I lived in the UK and had to settle for 50, which never felt quite right. While everything is now technically in HD, none of the textures have been remade, so they often look fairly flat. I wasn't expecting a complete remake, nor was that what Capcom promised, but it can be a touch distracting. What's less acceptable is everything outside the main gameplay sections. Menus have been left exactly as they were, which means a 4:3 aspect ratio and distinctly blurry text. I honestly have no idea why the menus couldn't have been tweaked to make them 16:9 and in HD. It's a terrible first impression. The cutscenes are in 16:9, but the aliasing is terrible, with more sharp edges per inch than Gillette's next brand of razor. I love some of these cutscenes, but it pains me that we aren't getting them in HD. The collection also includes a scattering of concept art, but that's about it for extras. If Capcom is going to re-release a collection that was first released 6 years ago, the least it could do is put some bonus content on there. There's plenty of other changes that could have been included with little effort. Let's start with the yellow orbs. These were rectified in the Devil May Cry 3 Special Edition, which let you ignore them completely by playing a gold version. If you really wanted to use them, then you could play the yellow version and then choose when to use your orbs to revive during a fight. Why on earth wasn't this extended to Devil May Cry 1 and 2? How difficult would it have been to add a gold option for those games? Purists could stick to the originals and normal people could play the gold version. It's also a touch annoying that you're restricted to normal mode at the start. Again, I appreciate there are people who want to play the games as they used to be, and that should definitely be left in as an option. However, couldn't they have also unlocked hard mode from the start? Some people have played through these games multiple times already and shouldn't have to play through 2 times just to play on a mode that challenges them. The first 2 games also provide painfully few instructions to help new players. Back in the day, games used to come with a tiny little book called an instruction manual, which taught players how to play the game. Think of it like a tutorial but with the words written down on paper. This collection doesn't come with any manuals and the combos aren't all that intuitive. I'm not sure how many players will figure out that pressing attack 3 times is different to pushing attack twice followed by a short pause and then pressing it again, which is in turn different from pushing attack twice followed by a longer pause then pressing attack again. Devil May Cry 3 actually bothers to tell you the combos, which is a big deal for new players. Something similar should have been added for the other games. There's no point to withholding this information from players or forcing them to hit up wikis. I'd played Devil May Cry before and still struggle to remember the combos. You expect inconsistencies between the 3 games, however collections like this should provide extra options to help smooth over the differences. For example, you can choose between 2 control options in Devil May Cry 1. I switched over to the secondary mode, which switched the attack and gun commands around. The second game then didn't offer any changes at all, so I had to use a completely different setup to the one I'd just been using. I've no idea why a few extra accessibility options couldn't have been added instead of keeping everything exactly the same from 2001. So yeah, as a collection this is disappointing. It comes across as lazy and a bit of a cash grab, when it should be a celebration of an excellent franchise. Hell, why not add Devil May Cry 4 into the mix instead of just porting over the 2012 collection? That's enough negativity. Devil May Cry 3 is an excellent game. If you haven't played it before, then I highly recommend it. The first game is still okay and perfectly playable, however it doesn't hold up anywhere near as well as 3. And the second game is in here too. If you still have access to the previous collection, then you don't need this one. If you don't and you're a huge fan of the franchise or you're just a little curious, then maybe wait until it hits $20 before diving in. Alright, if you enjoyed this review then perhaps consider subscribing, sharing and hitting the like button. I normally do longer form critiques, but I'll do reviews when I can get them up in a timely manner. I also stream on Twitch 5 times a week, write reviews for my website and moan a lot on Twitter. At the end of my last video I said my next one will be on Fallout 2. Obviously it's not. I drastically misremembered how long Fallout 2 was. I'm still working on my first playthrough, so that video is going to take a while longer. I have fond memories of Fallout 2 and I'm desperate to do it justice. In the meantime there should be another long form critique up this month. Okay, thanks for watching. Cheers.